You're watching FJTN, the Federal Judicial Television Network. The Federal Judicial Center presents Supervising Defendants and Offenders with Mental Disorders, Part 3. Moderating today's program, Bob Luke.
Hi, welcome. I'm Bob Luke, Education Specialist with the Federal Judicial Center, and I'd like to welcome you to this third part in our series of Supervising Defendants and Offenders with Mental Disorders. As you know, we have designed this program for new officers, but we also think it'll be a helpful review for those of you who have had experience in working with individuals with mental disorders. In this program, we're going to continue our emphasis on your role as an officer who supervises individuals with mental disorders by taking a look at what some of the unique supervision challenges are that you'll face and ways you can meet those challenges, and also some discussion of referring individuals for treatment and evaluations. We'll have a 10-minute break about halfway through the program. And now it's again my pleasure to welcome Miggy Baerga, who many of you know is the Mental Health Administrator for the Office of Probation Pretrial Services of the Administrative Office. And Miggy, you've been with us now for the first two programs. Thank you for coming back for number 3. It's always a pleasure to work with you.
Right.
And without further ado, let me turn it over to you to introduce our instructors.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you to all of you joining us today. In part 1 of our program, we gave you an overview of mental disorders, including their causes and treatment. In part 2, we reviewed ways you could identify individuals with mental disorders. Today, we turn our attention to your role in referring individuals for evaluation and treatment, as well as your role in supervising them during the treatment process. We'll also look at how you can plan for and respond to potential for violent behaviors on the part of these individuals. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our instructors for today's session, and they are Helene Krieger and Tom Granucci, both from the Central District of California. I'll start with Helene. She's an aftercare coordinator who is responsible for all the contracting procedures for treatment services and also coordinates the district's mental health program. She is a licensed clinical social worker and has worked in the mental health and criminal justice fields for 17 years. Our second instructor, Tom Granucci, is also a licensed clinical social worker, and he has supervised mental health cases for the last 4 years. He is presently a mental health treatment specialist, and he too has worked in the mental health and criminal justice fields for over 17 years. I know these two individuals personally, and I know you'll be in good hands. Enjoy the program.
Thank you, Miggy, and welcome to the third program in our mental health series. In the first 2 programs, we discussed the different forms of mental disorders, their causes and treatments, and ways that you could identify individuals with mental disorders by interviewing collateral sources and the individual, reviewing records, observing the individual, and we also discussed about recommending conditions to manage the risks posed by the mental disorders. Today is the third and final program. And today, Tom and I are going to talk about supervision. And I hope you all have your participant guide with you because we're going to be referring to it throughout today's program. So please turn to page 35. And we're going to look at our objectives for today. By the end of today, you'll be able to refer individuals for treatment, communicate with treatment providers, use supervision strategies to support an individual who's in treatment, and respond to crisis situations involving individuals with mental disorders. And Tom and I are going to be using the words individual, client, and offenders throughout the presentation. We're going to start by looking at the referral process. And of course, officers refer individuals to mental health providers for evaluation and for treatment. And there are 6 steps in this referral process. And these are also on page 35 of your guide. And the 6 steps are: identify a treatment provider, determine how services will be paid for, request services, prepare the individual to use the services, communicate with the individual and the provider throughout the treatment process, and terminate treatment. Now we're going to touch on each of these steps, but as always, please consult your supervisor to find out the preferred practices in your district. So probably the most important and probably difficult part of this process is to even identify providers. And I'm aware that districts vary in how they manage the referral and the contracting process. Some districts already have contracts in place with one or more providers, and in other districts you may first look to see, can you find services that may be low cost or no cost, and then if you can't find them, then you may initiate the contract process so that the district could pay for the services. But even if your district has contracts in place, it does help to have a variety of choices. And although some of the principles that we're going to use today can apply to finding contracted providers, we're really going to focus on looking for non-contract providers. And knowledge of these treatment providers and their fee schedules in your district can be helpful when you need to make referrals for clients that may be voluntary for treatment, that may be low risk, where your district's budget is limited, and for clients that may have their own resources. And some of these may include SSI or disability insurance for especially severely mentally ill clients, for individuals who have their own insurance. Veterans assistance is an excellent resource, and there are community-based non-contract providers that may provide no-cost or low-cost services. Now, how would you go about finding mental health services in your district? First, you may consult internal resources. Ask your supervisor if your district has compiled a manual of mental health resources, and also ask your colleagues. Consult Yellow Pages and local resource guides, such as those produced by the United Way. Call or visit professionals and local clinics, and they're more likely to accept a referral from you and then later provide you with information if they know you. Consult with professional associations such as state licensing boards, American Psychiatric Association, for a registry of licensed and certified psychological personnel. And finally, check with local colleges and universities. They often have low-cost clinics with up-to-date treatment services. Now, of course, it's best to locate more than one provider so that you have a choice. But I'm aware this isn't always possible, especially in rural areas and on reservations. Now, Tom is going to discuss selecting a provider.
Thanks, Aline. Hello, everyone. Now that you've identified several providers, how do you choose the individual provider, the best one that's going to have the resources to meet your individual client's needs? If you can turn with me to your guide on page 36, I'm going to ask you to do an exercise here. I want you to think about making a list of provider areas, not specific questions, we're going to get to that in a minute, but areas about a provider that you would want to know. For example, the type of treatment services that they provide. So I want to ask you to take a minute now, alone or with a partner, and go ahead and do this exercise. Welcome back. Now let's compare your list to the list that the committee developed. First of all, again, type of services, policies and procedures, especially those that would impact your client in regards to release of information and the provider giving information to you. Collaboration with other agencies. especially job assistance or housing assistance. Credentials. This is an important one. Many community clinics are staffed by interns. Now, an intern may be okay to treat your client as long as they're supervised by a licensed professional if the client is a low-risk client. For high-risk clients, you definitely want a licensed professional treating that person directly. Timeliness. You want to know whether there's a waiting list and how long it is. Involuntary clients. Does the agency or the provider have experience treating involuntary criminal justice clients? Specific location and hours of operation, and the costs. Now, if you'll turn with me to page 37 of your guide, let's think about the specific questions that we would ask the provider. So, for example, under type of treatment, you would want to ask the provider about screening, how do they do their evaluation, specialties they may have, the level of treatment, is it outpatient, inpatient, day treatment? Again, experience with involuntary clients, do they have bilingual capabilities, and what's their experience with multicultural populations? So now let's do another exercise. Let's identify some specific questions that you would ask the treatment provider. Again, by yourself or with a partner, select 3 areas and write 4 or more questions for each area. Let's take 3 minutes to do this now. We're back. Hope you have your questions ready. You can turn to your participant guide, pages 38 and 39. Now, the questions here can serve as a useful reference for you in the future, but I'm also going to take a minute here for you to skim them over. So go ahead, take a couple minutes now to look over the questions in your participant guide, pages 38 and 39. Again, I hope that list will provide, I trust that will provide a useful future reference for you. Now, I just want to make one point here. If you're using a non-contract provider, it's recommended that you have your mental health specialist review the provider periodically, at least on an annual basis, to be sure that there haven't been any changes in policies and procedures that may impact on the services that your client is receiving. Now that we have the provider selected, the remaining steps in the referral process are, of course, payment, requesting the services, preparing the individual, maintaining ongoing communication with the provider, and finally, the determination of treatment. If you'll turn with me to page 40 of your participant guide. In regards to payment, now this is a big issue because most of treatment is paid for by the districts. Per the Guide to Judiciary Policies and Procedures, it's the officer's responsibility to investigate non-contract sources for treatment. The officer must determine whether the offender can pay for treatment or not. Take a minute now to look at page 40 of your guide regarding these payment issues. If the client is not paying for services, consult with your supervisor or mental health specialist to see if there are alternatives. Now, when you request services through a provider, it's a good idea to follow up with a letter on any agreements that you made verbally over the phone. You'll find an outline on page 41 of an example that you can use for a follow-up letter to the provider. Now turning to page 42 of your guide in regards to preparing the individual for treatment. The steps in preparing the individual are to let the individual know the reasons for the referral. For example, I'm referring you to Dr. Smith because you have some problems with depression. I've worked with Dr. Smith in the past. I know he's good with clients who have problems with depression, so that's why I'm referring you to him. The next is functions and limitations of the agency. You want to explain to the client the treatment options. So for example, I'm referring you to Dr. Smith. He's a psychologist. So if he believes that you're so severely depressed that you need medication, he can't prescribe medication, but he will refer you to a psychiatrist in his agency to evaluate you. You want to explain the limitations in terms of the client's need to be honest with the provider. If the client's not honest with the provider cannot be helpful. Logistics and payment, again, where the provider is located. The provider's role and the potential benefits for the client. For example, you want to explain that the provider is a helping professional and the potential benefits to the client, such as if your depression improves, then you'll be able to start working again, which is one of your goals that you've said you have. In a pretrial situation, you can explain to the offender that compliance with mental health treatment may result in bail rather than detention. Finally, the probation officer's role in supporting treatment and securing release of information forms. Of course, you want to let the client know that you're going to be monitoring the process, that you expect their attendance, regular attendance, and of course that you're going to have to secure release of information forms so that you can communicate on an ongoing basis with the provider. Now, clients always ask me, first off, how long do I have to be in treatment? What I tell them is that I will base that on the recommendation of the mental health professional. I also explain limited confidentiality to them so that if they are suicidal, homicidal, have reverted to drug use, have reverted to criminal behavior, if they disclose any of this to the provider, I'll know about it. But their personal business, the personal details of their lives, I want them to feel comfortable and trust the provider in sharing those things, and I don't need to know about that. So now that you've prepared the individual for the referral, you've made the referral, let's turn back to Helene to discuss managing communications and the termination process. Helene?
Hi. Thank you, Tom. Now that you have an individual prepared for an evaluation or treatment, the next important step is managing the communication between you, the individual, and all the treatment providers so you can assess the extent to which the individual is receiving the required services and complying with his or her conditions of supervision. So as you know, an individual with a mental disorder can be under the care of various providers. They may be seeing a therapist for counseling, they may be seeing a psychiatrist for medication, maybe clergy for family counseling, maybe even a drug counselor. And part of your job is to make sure that each of these entities have the information that they need to provide the required services. Now, since you as a supervision officer will interact with all of these parties, you might see yourself as the hub of a communication wheel that has many spokes. You are in a central position to share information with the various providers and to make sure that they share information with each other. You become the ultimate case manager because of your position at this hub of the communication wheel. Now, you're not only a case manager, but a significant player in this treatment team. And this treatment team needs to be very firm and direct and clear and have direct communication so that the clients do not have the opportunity to be dishonest with the therapist or with you or try to play you against each other to cause conflict. And you want to be communicating with the providers to keep them focused on issues of risk and community safety. And of course, this is an excellent supervision tool. They're another great collateral resource for you. Now, you want to also facilitate the communication between the providers. You may have a drug counselor that knows that the individual has just tested positive for a substance, and they may not know that the client is on psychotropic medication. If they talk to the psychiatrist, they'll get information they need and possibly address a potentially harmful or even fatal interaction. Now, of course, all of this sharing of information needs to be within the bounds of signed release forms and confidentiality statutes and laws. And as you work with provider, remember they have two clients, U.S. probation or pretrial services and the individual. And to the extent possible, try to resolve confidentiality issues before treatment begins. Now, from a treatment provider's perspective, confidentiality must be preserved, except in the issues of mandated law, such as child abuse reporting, or if they need to warn a victim of imminent harm, such as in Tarasov versus the UC Regents of California. Therefore, you must use signed release forms to enable those providers to give you information that you need. Now, you need to let them know very clearly that you expect that they will give to you information on the client's compliance with their treatment conditions, particularly regarding attendance and medication. Now, it also may be helpful to point out to them that as a team member, you can really support and encourage that client to get to those sessions and to continue in treatment. Now, many officers contact providers an average of about once a month, and I think you should do that even if you're receiving written reports. That verbal communication is so important, so much more information can be shared, and you're continuing that very important process of building relationship. Now, the last step in the treatment process is terminating treatment. And terminating treatment should be a joint decision between you, the individual, and the treatment provider. And each should feel very confident that the individual is symptom-free and has benefited as much as possible from the services. And there's additional information regarding terminating treatment on page 44 of your guide. And I would also recommend that, like a few months before supervision is going to be expired, that you contact the treatment provider and let them know so they can discuss with the individual, are they going to continue treatment, and if not, they can do the therapeutic termination process. Okay, now Tom is going to talk about some special supervision issues.
Thanks, Elaine. Now, our final topic for the program is special supervision issues with mentally ill offenders. Mentally ill offenders can pose unique supervision challenges. Some officers in my office will tell me, I don't know how you do it, or I'm glad you have those cases. But today, we want to give you the information to empower you to meet these unique challenges. Now, the special supervision issues fall into three categories: maintaining relationship boundaries, being alert to potential violence, and responding to potential crises, including suicide, homicide, or psychotic episodes. First, let's talk about maintaining relationship boundaries. It's important to establish roles early. Some mentally ill clients are not good at maintaining appropriate relationship boundaries. They may see you as an authority figure, they may try to make you into their friend, they may try to turn you into their therapist. The key is being supportive and balancing the application of controlling and correctional strategies at the same time. If you'll refer to your participant guide on page 45, some ways to strike this balance. First of all, assist the individual as you would any other client. You may provide them with job assistance referrals, housing referrals, but you're not the direct provider of treatment. You may do some basic counseling with them. I'm sometimes surprised at the personal information that clients will disclose to me, being the authority figure I am. But it's not my role to do the therapy. I will always encourage them to speak to the provider and refer them back to the provider about those issues. You want to understand the difficulties that the disorder presents for the client. Now, this is a balance of empathy and accountability. When I'm talking about empathy, I'm not talking about sympathy or feeling sorry for someone. Empathy is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It's understanding the limitations the mental illness may pose for the person meeting supervision requirements. Be clear about supervision requirements. Be understanding but still set firm limits. Be clear about the consequences of noncompliance. As always, with any client, treat people fairly with dignity and respect. Now, you need to respond to violations appropriately. A mental health specialist colleague of mine back in the Central District, Curtis Sampson, has coined the phrase, risk drives response time. I love this phrase because it really captures that with some mentally ill clients, you're going to be involved in a lot of crisis management. And depending on the immediacy and the imminent risk, you're going to have to act quickly. You may have to drop everything and attend to that crisis. So now let's take a case example of a client who's not in compliance. We're going to take a look at a video. Take a look especially for the approach that the officer takes in this video. Now here's the case example. This is a 33-year-old woman, Ms. Kelly. She's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and she's currently in a manic phase. She's on a term of supervised release after doing 6 months custody time for credit card fraud violations. She does have a mental health condition, and the provider has just informed the officer that she's missed 5 out of her last 8 mental health sessions, and she failed to show for her latest blood test. The officer makes an unscheduled home visit. Notice how the officer responds to the client's concerns without promising anything. And also look at how she gets the treatment plan back on track. After you watch the video, I'm going to ask you to list some ways that the officer responds and still gets the plan back on track. So now let's take a look at this video.
Nice surprise. Please come right on in. If I'd known you were coming, I would have baked a cake.
Thanks. I was in your neighborhood.
Notice anything new?
Oh, wow. It's striking.
Don't worry, I didn't blow the mortgage money on it. It's a poster. Can you believe it?
I wouldn't have guessed. Very nice.
Thank you.
Anyway, I stopped by because I wanted to talk to you about your treatment plan.
Oh, no problem. I'm always happy to see you. Have a seat. The job is going just terrifically. It's working out so well. It's like the more hectic things get, the better I can handle it. I even have time to help those who aren't as fast as I am. My boss says I have a talent for havoc. She gave me a bonus and made me a team leader, so I got a raise too. I'll even be able to...
I'm glad things are going so well for you at work. Let's talk about your treatment. Your counselor, Mrs. James, called me Tuesday to say that you'd missed your last session and your last blood test.
You can't be thinking of sending me back. You know it doesn't do any good. I just get depressed in prison, and my problem is 100% solved. I've sworn off those devil cards for good, and now just pay cash for everything, so that way I never get in over my head. I've even made up a monthly budget. I would love to show it to you. You'll be so proud of me.
Could we sit down for a minute? Okay. I'm not talking about sending you back, and I would love to see your budget sometime, but right now I need to know why you're not making all your appointments. Can you tell me about that?
Well, like I said, things get hectic at work, especially now that I've got my own team. I end up working late, and before I know it, whoops, I've missed my appointment.
Well, we can be flexible on your times if that helps. It's open till 10 p.m.
That might help, but you should know, those sessions are a real drag. People just talk about sad things. My kids don't respect me. My husband is sleeping around. My boss thinks I'm stupid. And on and on and on. That's no fun.
Well, but you don't have to talk about just sad things. I'm sure the group would be interested to know about what's going well for you. Maybe you could share some coping strategies that could help the rest of the group.
Well, that might help some, but do you really think I need to go? I'm taking my meds like I was told to, holding down a 30-hour-a-week job, cooking meals for my family every single day, chairing the Fall Beautification Committee at Matt's school, and volunteering with the Red Cross. Plus, I'm planning on repainting and repapering every single room in this house. I get so sick of white. You know what I mean? Oh, just look at this gorgeous paper I picked out for Katie. She is going to adore it, and I adore doing it for her. They're having a fabulous sale at the home store if you want to buy some. I have to go back there anyway. I could go with you and help you pick it out. Did you know that I took courses in interior design?
Well, thank you. That's very kind. But right now, we need to focus on your treatment. Can we sit back down for a minute?
Well, sure.
I do think you need to continue seeing Mrs. James so you can get on an even keel. I also want you to take the blood test so we can be sure that you're getting the best medicine possible. You're making progress, but you still have a little ways to go. Right now, for instance, you're all over the place. You can't seem to sit still. And I did talk to your husband. He said you're always up.
Well, now that you mention it, people at work have said I can be hyper, but nobody said it was a big deal. I think they like it. Did Jim say it was a problem?
He said it's hard to connect with you at times because you seem to have so many different interests. And I think he's concerned that you're not getting enough rest. What do you think we can do to get you back on your treatment plan?
Well, do you think I need to go every week? Couldn't I go a little less often?
Maybe so. A person who is progressing, as you are, can sometimes change your schedule to go once every other week. What if we asked Mrs. James if she thought you were ready to go once every other week?
Wonderful. Let's do it.
Okay, I'll call her later and ask her what she thinks about you going once every other week. And you can talk to her about it at your next appointment, which is tomorrow evening at 6:30.
Tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. I won't forget. I will be there with bells on. This is one appointment I don't want to miss.
Well, thank you for your time. I hope it works out for you. And Mrs. James will let me know what you two decide.
Great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Welcome back. That's certainly a difficult situation that you could face managing these cases. Now, if you'll turn with me to page 45 of your participant guide, I want to ask you to take 5 minutes, again, alone or with a partner, and write the ways that the officer responded to get the treatment plan back on track. Again, 5 minutes. Go ahead and do that exercise now. Welcome back. Now let's compare and contrast your list with the list the committee developed. You'll find that on page 46 of your guide. The officer listened to the client's objections. She kept a calm demeanor. She discussed the objections. For example, she said that maybe the client can go to a later time for the appointment. She agreed to explore a modification of the frequency of the sessions, going from weekly to twice a month. And she said she would continue to monitor the client's progress. Now, there's a few other issues here that I would like to highlight. First of all, the issue of notification from the provider. I would want to know a lot sooner than 5 sessions that a client like this has not been attending treatment. Also, with a client with manic depression in a manic phase, there is some potential for violence. So depending on the client's background and history, you may want to confront the noncompliance in the office rather than going into the field. Also, if you do go in the field, you want to take a partner with you. As far as the interview itself, you may want to step in a little sooner than that officer did to calm her down and focus her. And you also could confront her directly about how manic she is right there in front of you. Now let's turn to the issue of potential violence. Many officers think that they need to be especially alert to the potential violence from mentally ill clients. This may be due to the fact that the only officer ever killed in the line of duty, Tom Gall from the Southern District of Indiana, was killed by a client who had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Now, a lot of media attention occurs when there's violence committed by the mentally ill, and also the research can be somewhat confusing in this area. I'm personally cautious myself because in 1989, a psychiatric social worker colleague of mine, Robin Panich, was murdered by a client in the clinic. Now, I didn't know Robin real well. I worked with her, and that's something that has really stuck with me all these years and not something I want to see any of you have to go through. But the research indicates that the mentally ill are not more inclined to violence than the general population. In fact, the research indicates that the mentally ill make up no more than 3% of violence in America. The mentally ill are much more likely to be a victim than they are to be a perpetrator. Mental health cases can be a wide range, from the severely mentally ill to the mildly depressed and everything in between. But there are risk factors to be alert to. If you turn to Participant Guide page 46, let's take a look at the potential warning signs and risk factors. First of all, history of violence. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Secondly, diagnosis of a severe mental illness, especially if the person is non-compliant with medications. Also, if the person is hallucinating, command hallucinations, voices telling the person to hurt themselves or hurt others, add to the risk. Substance abuse, alcohol or drug use further increases the risk. And also abuse as a child. If the person suffered from abuse as a child, they may be more prone to violence as an adult. Now, one note on adjustment disorder that you'll see in your guide. Adjustment disorder diagnosis is generally thought of as the lowest risk, but a person who's gone through a recent loss of a job, breakup of a relationship or marriage, illness, when you add those precipitants on to the risk factors that I just mentioned, the risk can increase. I know in our district we're seeing more severe Axis I cases with an Axis II disorder of antisocial personality, borderline, or narcissistic, plus substance abuse on top of that. Now, all three of those together are clearly the highest risk cases. The bottom line is this: don't assume that all clients with mental health diagnoses are dangerous and be fearful of all of them. You do want to know who you have in front of you in relation to the risk factors, and you don't want to underestimate who you have in front of you. Always take precautions. Well, this brings us to what you've been waiting for, which is the break. So we're going to take 10 minutes now, so go ahead and enjoy a little break, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your break and you're refreshed and ready to move on for the second half of the program. Now I'm going to turn it back to Helene to discuss crisis management, suicide, and interventions in a crisis.
Thank you, Tom. Now, the major reason for being alert to these warning signs or red flags is that it may alert you to an individual who is about to commit suicide, do violence to another person, or suffer a psychotic episode. So we're going to conclude our discussion today about supervising individuals with mental disorders with a review of how you may respond to each of these crisis situations. But first, I want to make some general points about crisis situations. First of all, these crisis situations will not always be clear-cut or mutually exclusive, and you cannot assume that you'll be dealing with just one of them at any one time. An individual may be suicidal, homicidal, and even psychotic all at the same time. Any crisis situation, such as these three, which presents an imminent risk to an individual or others, demands your immediate intervention. Remember what Tom said earlier, risk drives response time. For suicide or homicidal threats, the more specific the plan, coupled with the individual's ability to carry out the plan, the more immediate the crisis and the more immediate the need for intervention. The goal of supervision is to get that individual to a hospital or mental health provider so that he or she does not hurt anyone and that he or she receives the medical attention needed. The last point is be mentally prepared. Have a plan for how you would respond to a crisis situation. Know your district's policies and local emergency resources. Some policies vary by district, such as who can transport an individual to a hospital or what hospital admission criteria are. Check with your supervisor regarding the policies in your district. Now let's discuss some special considerations associated with each of these crisis situations. And we're going to start with suicide. Now, suicide is a situation that we all hope we never have to encounter. But if you work with mentally ill clients, it is possible that you will be dealing with the threat of suicide. Now, suicidal threats may merely be a cry for help or attention. However, we may never assume that. We always have to take each of these seriously and have this evaluated by a mental health professional. And there are some individuals with specific mental disorders that may be more prone to suicidal threats than others, and that are clients with borderline personality disorders and clients with mood disorders such as depression. And you can use the acronym SAD persons as a tool to help you identify the potential suicidal individual. And we're going to go through each of these letters, and this acronym is on page 47 to 48 of your guide. Now, in the word SAD, the S stands for sex. Women attempt suicide more frequently, but men are 3 times more successful at suicide, and that's typically because they use more lethal means. And however, this does not mean that you cannot take the gestures made by women seriously. A is for age. The older the individual, the higher the risk. And risk in the elderly is very high compared to the low statistical norms of suicide in the general population. D stands for depression. Individuals who are depressed pose the highest risk. P is for previous attempts. The more previous attempts, the higher the risk. E is for ethanol abuse. Alcohol and drug use increase risk. R is for rational thinking loss. Individuals contemplating suicide are not thinking rationally, and the presence of psychosis, hallucinations, or other delusional thinking increases risk. S, social support lacking. individuals without a social support system run a higher risk for suicide. O is for organized plan. The more organized the individual's suicide plan, the higher the probability that the individual will succeed. For example, it's one thing for an individual to say, I sometimes think about ending it all, and quite another if they say, I keep a fully loaded 22 under my bed. Now, the letter N stands for no spouse or significant other, and individuals without the support of a relationship, that is, those who are single or recently divorced, separated, or widowed, pose a higher risk of suicide. And S is for sickness. If the person has a chronic, debilitating, or severe illness, it may lead him or her to consider death as an alternative to living with the illness. So now we're going to examine some intervention steps to respond to a potential suicide. For example, let's say you're on a home contact with a woman who has been diagnosed with severe depression, and she fits many of the characteristics of that SAD person's acronym that we just reviewed. You are both sitting at the kitchen table. You look over and you see on the counter different prescription medication, and you also see a large knife at the sink. She begins getting very agitated, and she suddenly blurts out, "My life is a mess. I just want to get it over. A handful of those pills will do the trick." What are your concerns in this situation, and what would you do? I'd like for you to take 3 minutes, alone or with a partner, to make a list on page 48 of your guide of the actions you would take in this situation. I'll see you in 3 minutes. Welcome back. Now, we first suggest that you follow whatever procedures are in place in your district, and I believe that's what you put on your list. Now, if you don't have district policies, we have a few suggestions. One is you may want to put the individual on the phone with a suicide or crisis hotline so that they could come up with a plan. Now, another option is you may want to call the police and ask them to transport the individual to a hospital. And in some districts, the police, local mental health professionals, or local hospitals may have psychiatric emergency teams that may come out and come to the home and to assess if the individual is eminently dangerous to themselves or others, and then they would transport. But as you can see, it's very important that you know your district's policies and that you know your local's resources. So make sure that their crisis does not become a crisis for you. Have a plan so that you know how you're going to respond. Now, prior to making contact with an individual that you suspect may be suicidal or homicidal, first of all, try to get them to come into the office. But if you choose to go out to the field, arrange for a partner to come with you. And if you know that a dangerous individual is on their way to the office to see you, make sure that you alert your security, your receptionist, your supervisor, and your coworkers. Now, Tom is going to talk about responses to a suicide plan.
Thanks, Celine. You'll find this material on page 49 of your guide. If it appears a person is thinking about suicide, how do you respond? First of all, ask questions about the plan. As Helene said, the more specific the plan, with a prior history and with access to means, the higher the risk. Using the word suicide won't put an idea in someone's head. Don't be shocked if somebody mentions suicide. Don't shame the individual, and don't debate the person over the rightness or wrongness of suicide. You're going to have to be prepared to discuss suicide in an objective, professional manner. Communicate that you want to help. Tell the client, I'm concerned about you. I need to know that you're safe. Call the mental health provider. You can set up an appointment or consult on the need to send the person to the hospital. Give them the number of a local suicide hotline. And here I want to give you a national number, 1-800-SUICIDE. Again, 1-800-SUICIDE, that will connect you with local suicide hotlines. A no suicide contract. Now, this is where the person, verbally or in writing, agrees to not harm themselves before they've taken some action. Either they've called their therapist, they've called you, they've called a suicide hotline. No suicide contracts don't always work. The only suicide I've had in my professional career, I had a no suicide contract with. So they're no guarantee, but that doesn't mean you don't do them. You want to use these for two reasons. First of all, they're diagnostic. If a person cannot contract with you there in the office, then you know you have an imminent situation on your hands. Also is the liability issue. If you have a no suicide contract in place and the person still kills themselves, you've covered yourself liability-wise. Finally, call an ambulance or the local police if the person does take some action, like taking pills or any other action that can be harmful to themselves. Now, a couple cautions. Be wary if the individual insists the crisis is over. This may mean that they've decided to follow through with their suicide plan, especially people who've recently started on antidepressants. Before, they may have not had the energy to act on their plan, and the medication may actually give them the energy to follow through. On the other hand, it may mean it was helpful talking to you, but it doesn't mean that the whole situation has been magically resolved. In either case, have the individual talk with you about specific future plans. What are they doing later today, tomorrow, for the rest of the week? You want to see that they have hope for the future and they're making plans for the future. Now, your own safety. Sometimes in the past we thought of suicidal people as only dangerous to themselves, but they can be dangerous to others as well. It's sometimes a fine line between suicide and homicide. In trying to help a suicidal person, always put your own safety first. A suicidal person may be dangerous to you as well. If you're in a home visit and the suicidal person has a weapon, get out of the situation. If you see a potential weapon in the home, distance the client from it. Always know a direct escape route out of the home. Suicide is a tragedy. It's difficult for all involved, especially for the surviving family members, but it's also difficult for us professionals as well. As I said, I've experienced losing a client myself. You can expect to feel some guilt on your part. Talk to your friends, your colleagues, use the employee assistance program if you need to, but do take care of yourself. Finally, always remember that ultimately that person is responsible for their behavior and for their suicide. You cannot stop someone from killing themselves. Now let's turn to homicide. This you'll find on page 50 of your participant guide. The same techniques and strategies that we use for a suicidal situation, we use in a homicidal situation. To respond to a homicidal threat, you first must assess the potential for violence. Again, the more specific and detailed the plan, the more serious the threat. Access to weapons, a history of previous violence, and current alcohol and drug use further increase the risk. Consider your own safety first. If you're in a home visit, leave the house. Don't try to be a hero. Remember, as a federal official, if threats are made against you, you may request a bench warrant from the court. Warn third parties and authorities. Third-party risk from an individual making threats who has a mental disorder is no different than an individual making threats without a mental disorder. You handle them the same way. Failure to warn potential victims could result in civil liability for yourself, so protect yourself. Follow the guide to judicial policies and procedures. You are to warn third parties, but not disclose confidential information unless it's required to protect potential victims. Pretrial service officers should report these threats both to the court and to the United States Attorney's Office. Report the incident. Record it in your chronos, report it to your supervisor, report it to the mental health provider, and if it rises to the level of a hazardous incident, report it to the administrative office. Now let's turn to psychotic episodes. This is the last crisis situation that we'll discuss. As you've learned, this is a situation where the individual has lost contact with reality. The most common is auditory hallucinations. This can be as simple as the person hearing a voice call their name, but it can include command hallucinations, where they hear voices telling them to kill themselves or to do harm or kill others. Now, there are two types of psychotic individuals you may encounter. One is the person who experiences chronic, continual, recurring psychotic episodes. For example, Ralph, a man in his mid-50s who was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager. Despite antipsychotic medications, for all these years, Ralph continues to see terrifying images of monsters coming out of the walls at him. But Ralph knows that these are not real. On the other hand, an individual experiencing an acute psychotic episode may be more dangerous. For example, Carla, who's on my caseload. She was camping at a national park with her boyfriend. She's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She was manic and psychotic. She thought he was Satan. Fortunately, he survived her stabbing attack. Now, as mentioned before, risk increases when the individual is psychotic. Even if you've had a good relationship with that individual in the past, you cannot rely or depend on that. The safety risk is especially high if the delusional content is paranoid. The person may be fearful of you and may strike out at you before they think you can strike out against them. How do you manage these episodes? Please turn to page 51 of your guide. The response to a psychotic episode. First, assess the seriousness of the situation. Don't argue with the individual. Try to calm and reassure them. Take safety precautions if necessary. Arrange for the individual to be transported to a hospital or local treatment provider. Again, warn third parties if necessary. Report the incident to the mental health provider, your supervisor, and document it in your chronos. File a hazardous incident report with the administrative office if the individual has threatened or assaulted you. Again, do not assume that a good relationship that you've had with the individual in a prior time is the same when they're psychotic. Be cautious. Now, these crisis situations are possible with mental health cases. It's also possible that you never encounter any of them. However, it's best to be aware of their possibility and to plan ahead. Let's turn to documenting these crisis situations. You'll find this material on page 52. If you do encounter one of these crisis situations, you want to document immediately. This is not the kind of note that you set aside to record in your chronos the next morning when you come in. In case anyone challenges what you did, you want to document it right away. Describe what the individual said. Try to record as much of the individual's comments verbatim as possible and describe his or her behavior during the situation. Indicate who you contacted for assistance and what kind of assistance was provided. Describe any plan of action and indicate if the individual agreed to it. Note the time, date, place of the episode, and describe any referrals that were made and whether the client complied or not. Now I'd like to turn it back to Helene to discuss continuing education and an overview of the program.
Thank you, Tom. Now, in this three-part program, we've covered a lot of information concerning working with individuals with mental disorders. However, this was designed to be an introduction to this topic, and there's much more to learn. And on pages 53 to 54 in your guide, there are additional resources that you can consult to continue your development in this area. Now, you want to note on those pages the reference to the Office of Probation and Pretrial Services website on the JNet that has a web page on mental health and substance abuse. And at our end of part 2, Migdalia Bierga showed in depth how do you get to that website. And also, and it has a lot of really good information. Also on that website, in the section entitled Resource Center, you can get to the handbook for working with defendants and offenders with mental disorders. And this is a great reference guide on different disorders and even gives specific supervision tips for each disorder. And as you know, Miggy, or Migdalia Bierga, the mental health administrator for the Office of Probation and Pretrial Services, she is an excellent resource. She is very available and is very helpful. Now, for ongoing training, the FJC recommends that officers participate in presentations, brown bag lunches, any program that may expand officers' knowledge on this topic. And you may want to consider the following suggestions. The district mental health specialist or local treatment provider can prepare a 1 or 2 hour presentation on specific topics such as depression, individual treatment, or any other topic that you may find beneficial. The FJC also has some officer safety programs, and you can contact them if you're interested. The FJC Media Library, they have videos on depression, panic disorders, anxiety disorders, and a lot of other disorders listed in the handbook and that we've gone through talked about in this program. And you may suggest that your training specialist show the videos at lunch or maybe puts together a small presentation utilizing some of these videos. Another suggestion is if you're in an area where they have training hospitals, you may want to contact the Department of Psychiatry or Social Work to see if your officers can participate in some in-staff training. Now, I would also suggest that you may want to present actual cases to other officers or mental health specialists. And this can be done by presenting background information on a case and then bringing up some issues that you may be wrestling with or you may have some questions on. And this is a great way for officers to share ideas and to expand the way that you may look at supervision and treatment. And it's also a great vehicle for sharing resources. Now, the last way that you can continue your training in working with individuals with mental disorders is to actually use the skills and information that we've presented in this three-part program. For example, in your next interview, use some of the questions and interview techniques that were gone over in Part 2. Start looking for treatment providers now and put together a list of resources. Include the name of the agency, contact names and numbers, a description of the services, so that as soon as you have your next referral, you already have a resource that you can use. And third, prepare a plan of how you would respond to a crisis situation in the field and also in the office, and share this plan with your coworkers. At the beginning of this series, we noted that some of the biggest obstacles to working with these individuals with mental disorders is the lack of knowledge about mental disorders, about psychiatric terminology, lack of knowledge on how to work with individuals with specific disorders, and also how do you address the potential for danger. We believe that the knowledge and skills presented in this program can, with continued training and development on your part, enable you to become increasingly confident in your ability to interview individuals, identify the warning signs of mental disorders, and handle any unpredictable situation that may come your way. In time, your proficiency will increase, and you may find, as many officers have, that working with this population is some of the most interesting and rewarding work that you will do. We thank you for your participation and interest in this program, and back to you, Bob.
Thank you, Helene, and I'd like to thank you and Tom for a very informative presentation, and would also like to thank you for all of the good work you did helping us to get ready for this program. Would also, before we close, would like to turn again to Miggy. I understand that you have some information about some new developments on your mental health website that would be of interest to officers.
Yes, as you know, last week we talked about how to access the mental health and substance abuse website. I've added some information on there, research data to basically bring awareness to the relationship between mental health and violence. I've also added some links on there regarding how to identify treatment providers. So SAMHSA has a link on there for identifying treatment facilities, and that's nationwide. And also I'd like to point the field to the links page that has about 4 websites that deal with directly with suicide and suicide prevention, diagnostic screens and all that. So I'd like to point the field out to those additions on the website.
All right. Sounds like that would be a very helpful website. I'm sure officers would avail themselves of it. Would like to also thank all of you for your time and participation during these 3 broadcasts. I hope you have found them helpful to your work working with individuals with mental disorders. And we all look forward to seeing you here for future FJTN programs. Take care.